Welcome, Contemporary Issues students. We're still discussing issue number 3, is bigger government better government? From the Taking Sides, Clashing Views on Political Issues. And our reading today is going to be taken from the No Side, Saving Freedom by Jim DeMint. I want to have students right now pause the video, turn to 388 in the back of your text to find out who Jim DeMint is and read his little bio. Now, once you've done that, you can begin the article, which is found on page 46 of the text. Let us begin reading. Big Government's Impossible Dream, Making Everything Right for Everyone. The proliferation of special interests in Washington has created a threat to freedom quite different from the tyranny of the majority. Majority interests in America are now secondary to the politics of special interests. The election of 2008 demonstrated how a political party could bundle the interest of numerous groups and create a new ruling majority, a new tyranny of special interests. This new political dynamic is the antithesis of the intent of our Constitution and a serious blow to the cause of freedom. The rights of individuals protected by equal justice and the rule of law are now subjugated to the special rights of groups that are guaranteed by a strong centralized government. The common good is now viewed as a conglomeration of disparate interests of multiple groups demanding special treatment. There are a lot of good reasons for Americans to fight back against the centralization of special interest power in Washington, but the most important reason is that it creates a dysfunctional government. It may be a cliche, but it's true. Washington is broken. Almost everything our federal government attempts to do becomes a disaster. We mandate that cars burn corn ethanol and cause a world food crisis. We combine social engineering with monetary policy and create a worldwide financial crisis. We have left one catastrophe after another in our wake as we have attempted to save the world, dry every tear, and solve every problem. Freedom is protected by a wide range of public and private institutions guarding against the concentration of power. The concentration of power at the federal level destroys this balance, weakens other institutions of freedom, and destroys freedom itself. Americans must not continue to allow one institution of freedom, the federal government, to dominate and diminish the role of other institutions or to demean the individual values that made our country great and free. America needs champions of freedom at the state and local levels who will challenge the growing concentration of power in Washington. Governors and state legislatures could take much more control of education, health care, transportation, energy, and other services that would give their citizens more independence from the federal government. This could help begin the process of downsizing the federal government. Business leaders could unite around common goals to reduce corporate taxes, duplicate regulations, and frivolous lawsuits at the state and federal levels. Every dollar and decision we keep from Washington today means more freedom for all Americans tomorrow. Freedom versus big government. Unlimited government leads to unlimited debt and socialism. Long ago, in a distant land, a very old man called his son to his dying bed. There he revealed an amazing secret. The old man's father had bequeathed him a genie he kept locked in a small cage and hidden in a closet. The genie provided 2 services to the kingdom where the man's family lived for generations. First, he protected the people from any person or country that attempted to harm them. Second, he guaranteed all the citizens of the kingdom were treated equally and fairly. Because of these 2 protections, their kingdom was the happiest and most prosperous in the land. The man told his son to bring the genie's cage to his bedside. "The genie is now your responsibility," he said, "but you must never ask him to do any more than the 2 services he has provided for years. If you do, he will grow in size and strength with every new request. Then he will break out of his cage and become a threat to the kingdom instead of a blessing." The son promised to heed his father's warnings, and for several years he kept his promise. Then a neighbor's house burned along with all the possessions in the house. Instead of waiting for the community to help the man rebuild his home, as was the kingdom's custom, the son decided to ask the genie to help. The whole community was amazed at the beautiful new home with all the man's possessions restored. They held a great celebration for the son and gave him a beautiful award. But soon another man's home was destroyed by a flood. And instead of rushing to help, the community came to the son's house and demanded that the genie restore the man's home. The son relented and asked the genie to help. This time the genie grew large enough to break out of the cage. He escaped, and everywhere he went, someone asked him to do something new. He grew and began to demand more and more food and possessions from the kingdom. The genie built a huge castle on a hill and demanded that all citizens bring him half of everything they produced. But citizens continued to ask for more and more, and the genie continued to grow and demand more and more from the citizens. The people became weaker and poorer, and their kingdom eventually disappeared from the land. America's founders knew they were putting a powerful genie in a cage when they formed the federal government. They knew that historically all democratic governments grew until they consumed the freedom of the people and ultimately collapsed under their own weight. They knew that American people would have to remain constantly vigilant to restrain the growth of government. And they knew, like the genie in the story above, the federal government would grow every time we asked it to do something new. But our founders left us a cage to protect ourselves against the genie of government growth, the Constitution. After my first election in Congress in 1998, I spent November, December, and the first few weeks of January 1999 setting up my office, hiring staff, and fighting to get on the committees that aligned with my priorities: tax reform, Social Security reform, health care reform, and education choice. Most of these issues were handled by the powerful Ways and Means Committee that was reserved for senior members or vulnerable Republicans who needed to raise a lot of money. Apparently, outside groups gave a lot of money to committee members who would tinker with the tax code. They were less interested in people like me who really wanted to reform the tax code. I never got on the Ways and Means Committee during my 6 years in the House. Swearing-in ceremonies for the new Congress were in late January. My wife and 4 children traveled to D.C. to watch from the House gallery as I took the oath of office. Every member of the House had to stand in the House chamber, raise his right hand, and recite the oath of office at the beginning of each new Congress. I had never given a lot of thought to the oath until I took it, and frankly was a little surprised by what it actually said. I guess I expected to swear allegiance to my country and agree to do whatever I thought was best for my state and the American people. But the oath was a simple pledge to defend the Constitution. I, Jim DeMint, do solemnly swear that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign or domestic, that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same, that I take this obligation freely, without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion, and that I will faithfully discharge the duties of office on which I am about to enter, so help me God. There is nothing in this oath about representing my district and state or helping the poor and downtrodden. There was nothing about responding to the woes of the American people. There was no list of duties because everything we were supposed to do in Congress was written in the Constitution. All federal officers, the President and his cabinet, justices on the Supreme Court, and members of the armed services all take an oath to protect and defend the Constitution. It must have been really important at one time. I rarely heard the Constitution spoken of again, not when considering legislation, not when considering any new government program. It was never used as justification for legislation because there was little we did that fit within the limited powers of the federal government specified by the Constitution. The Constitution gives Congress the power to make laws for specific federal purposes, raise revenues or taxes, and spend money. It charges the President with the responsibility to execute the laws and command the military, and it gives the Supreme Court and other federal courts the responsibility of ensuring equal justice under the law. The areas in which Congress is allowed to make laws and spend money are confined primarily to protecting Americans against enemies and against enemies foreign and domestic, by establishing and funding the military, and by punishing counterfeiters and pirates on the high sea. Article 1, Section 8. Congress is also given the power to regulate commerce between, not within, the states and foreign nations, and to establish post offices and post roads. Section 9 of Article 1 then tells Congress several things it can't do, including showing preference to states and spending money unless it is properly appropriated by law. This is where most of Congress's mischief originates. Politicians and even some judges have said this section gives Congress the power of the purse to spend money on anything it pleases. This is categorically absurd. It is clear in context that Congress only has authority to fund actions consistent with those powers given to Congress in Section 8. The modern-day interpretation of Section 9 of Article 1 completely undermines all the restraints in size and scope of the federal government that were the primary purpose of the Constitution. Today, Congress makes laws, spends money, and raises taxes for small local projects, traffic lights, and water projects, for preferential requests from specific states, museums, and to satisfy demands from special interest groups, farmers, unions, minorities, senior citizens, veterans, etc. It won't be easy to turn this around because most American voters are now dependent in some way on federal beneficence. The federal government now provides funding and heavily regulates public education, health care, retirement income, Social Security, farming, transportation, research, water and sewer services, banking and financial services, electric utilities, environmental standards, business and labor relations, and a myriad of other activities not found in the Constitution. It is perhaps naive and unrealistic to believe that Americans who are heavily dependent on these federal services would ever support a return to a pure constitutional framework. I do believe, however, that if Americans could grasp the disastrous long-term impact of allowing our federal genie continued growth, they would force elected officials and judges to focus more on the protective cage provided by the Constitution. Then we could begin to restrain the growth of the federal government. The next part will be continued on part 2 of this issue.